Typically, most video game developers with successful IPs will do one of three things. Number 1, take the time to ensure each game within the franchise will deliver a satisfying and enjoyable experience to the player. Number 2, some developers will sell the rights to another developer, usually due to not knowing where to take the franchise next, running out of passion for their franchise, or because they simply can't afford to make any more games. Then there's number 3, developers will see an opportunity to milk their franchises dry with copy and pasted games that feel marginally different, but tons worse than the originals. Most developers that carry on their franchises will do this with sequels, prequels, remakes, and spin-off games. Spin-off games usually allow developers to get experimental by either trying out new gameplay mechanics or telling a brand new story from a perspective not yet explored in their franchise. Despite that being the case, Resident Evil Code Veronica, although technically being a spin-off game, does not feel like a spin-off game. The game involves two of the main heroes from previous Resident Evil games, and one of, if not the, biggest villain in the franchise. The game plays exactly like a classic mainline Resi game too, fixed camera angles and item management to boot, but most Resident Evil spin-off games are made up of rail shooters and buggy half-baked multiplayer games. Code Veronica looking and acting like a mainline RE game is no coincidence, as most Resident Evil fans know at this point that Code Veronica was initially going to be Resident Evil 3, and Nemesis was going to be a spin-off, but Capcom are Jill stans and wanted to give her another game. Knowing that this was the original plan kind of makes sense of Resident Evil 3 as a whole really, as despite being titled in the main line of games, it plays and acts like a spin-off game, copying locations, enemies, introducing new gimmicks, and being significantly shorter than the others in the franchise. Capcom essentially casting Code Veronica to the side has meant that a lot of people have overlooked this game, but it deserves so much more love and should be considered a mainline game. Another big reason that it wasn't such a big hit at the time was because it launched on the Dreamcast, which didn't do too well. It also came out after the classic PlayStation trilogy, but just a few years before the original Remake, 0 and RE4, and so it's in this sort of limbo where it looks too good for the classics but not as good as the other games, which makes the game look uncanny as hell. I love the Resident Evil franchise, well, most of the franchise, and I especially love this game in particular. Whilst my RE journey did not start with this one, that honour belongs to RE5, it kicked off my interest in the rest of the franchise. Playing through this game made me want to visit everything else in the franchise I had missed just in time for the RE2 remake, which I couldn't have cared less about a year before its release, but this game changed all of that. This game is perfect for fans of both classic and new RE, I think. Whilst a lot of the gameplay revolves around puzzle solving and item management, it does contain a little bit of action now and then. Resident Evil currently is in a renaissance period, thanks to Resident Evil 7 saving the franchise from obliterating itself into an oblivion. Capcom has wasted no time revamping older games for newer audiences. Most people are certain that RE4 will get a remake, which yes, I agree with. However, I think it's time Capcom stopped overlooking Code Veronica. Seriously, it's almost abuse at this point. RE4 is the kid who gets all the praise, whilst the slightly less successful child gets the cold shoulder. Code Veronica is more than just a reject, and in this video I'm going to tell you why this game deserves a remake. I'm not saying it needs one, but hey, if everyone else is getting one, why not? For this video, I'm going to be talking about some aspects of the game and how they could potentially be improved for a remake. Starting with the story, so far the remakes we have gotten have stayed fairly true to the overall stories of the originals, whilst changing some scenarios around. However, there is always the issue of something being changed for the worse. We don't want another Brad Vickers on our hands. Hopefully Capcom has learned from RE3 and will be more careful with what they change. Code Veronica deserves the 5-star treatment. The story begins with a voiceover telling us about current events involving characters' whereabouts and their goals. This time around, Claire is the lead, currently breaking into an Umbrella research facility in France, continuing her search for her big brother Chris. That's strong sisterly love right there. Breaking into a corrupt company's facility known for making terrifying monsters. My sister won't even share a pack of Sour Patch Kids with me. This would be a great place for a remake to work its magic. One thing I enjoyed about the RE2 and RE3 remakes was the introduction sequences. The originals, although effective at showing the horrors that you await in Raccoon City, did tend to drag on a bit too much. The remakes are a lot more interactive, allowing the player to experience some of these events, rather than just witnessing them. The RE3 remake also does a great job of showing how Jill wasn't 100% fine after the mansion, and showing us her dedication to taking Umbrella down. That's why in a potential Code Veronica remake, Capcom could skip past most of this cutscene and dialogue and have us play as Claire breaking into the facility, snooping around and looking for any clues that could point her in the direction of Chris, before being apprehended by Umbrella security personnel. This would be a better way to present the story to the player, and it could also give us a cameo from a familiar face. face, maybe someone like Jill Valentine. In the RE games, we have yet to see these two characters cross paths, so maybe this is a good place to fill that gap. Maybe Jill is the one to help Claire bust into the facility. Maybe all the digging around she did in RE3 gave her a few clues that maybe Chris was being held by Umbrella. This also makes sense as Jill has a lot more experience in breaking into Umbrella facilities than Claire, and it could also tie into the post-credit scene of Resident Evil 3 Remake. Not sure how, but somehow. The overall story of the game wasn't the issue for me, it was the characters themselves that had issues. A few characters in the game could have been handled a lot better. Whilst it was great to see Wesker again, rather than feel like a danger Chris and Claire had to overcome, he felt more like a cameo just to please fans. He had a lot of potential to come back in a big way, but it kind of falls flat. A reason for this is because there is no build up to his return, he just sort of shows up behind Claire. This moment should have been saved for Chris, given their history at this point and their rivalry we see in the future. This could be a great thing to change as well for a remake. Instead of meeting Wesker in the first act of the game, he could be introduced a little bit later once Claire and Steve have left the island and once Chris gets there. Although we think we are somewhat safe, it's a little too quiet for Chris, and so he searches the island when his old friend reveals himself. Wesker tells Chris that he attacked the island, and because Chris can't find Claire, it causes the two to begin to fight. This would be so much better, I feel, as it's a lot more satisfying to find out Wesker survived the same time Chris did. Wesker's character isn't the problem, it's just the way he's implemented that I have issues with. I do, however, have a problem with Steve's character, like a lot. We are introduced to Steve early on in the story when he shows us a glimpse of his stupidity by shooting at Claire, thinking her to be a zombie, despite witnessing Claire walk just fine and duck for cover when he begins to fire at her, and yet he still continues to shoot her.
Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those Shut up!
Steve is thrown into the game to act as the mysterious cool hero who acts all sad and edgy, alluding to a tragic backstory. But with Steve, he just comes off as really annoying and pathetic, which in part can be blamed by the voice performance.
What's wrong, Steve? Shoot him!
Wait! I can't!
I know voice acting isn't exactly the best in Resident Evil, but Steve really takes the biscuit. Whilst most of the characters have a significant part to play in the game, Steve's inclusion really does feel forced, almost as forced as him being a love interest for Claire, despite only knowing her for hours. Was this game seriously trying to convince us that Claire shared these feelings for Steve, even though we nearly get her killed like 4 times? I love the inclusion at the end of the game, that it's left in the air as to what happens to Steve. Wesker alludes to him still being alive, and that he's going to test on him, which was probably hinting at another appearance from Steve in the future, and yet we've not seen him since. Although my ideal Code Veronica remake would have Steve be erased from history, it really does give Capcom the opportunity to redeem Steve's character. They need to make him a lot more interesting, relatable, less annoying, and preferably take out the sexual tension aspect of his and Claire's relationship. It's so unnecessary, and a little bit creepy, now looking back on it.
And what was your plan tonight?
Another new addition to the game that I think could be significantly improved for a remake is Alexia. There's no question that Alexia's design is one of the most unique in the series, but despite her killer looks, she has a fairly bland personality. It seems that Capcom spent too much time giving Alfred a personality instead of evenly balancing the two twins. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the twins' dynamic, even if it did come across as a bit incestuous. What beautiful breasts you have, Alexia. But Alexia wasn't that interesting in terms of character. Again, this was another issue of having 3 villains all clamouring for the spotlight, as none of them were utilised to their fullest potential. This again reinforces my idea of having Wesker be encountered by Chris in his portion of the game, which frees up some time for us to get introduced to Alexia sooner. I think it would also be a good idea to change Alfred's involvement in the narrative slightly, as he famously dons his sister's clothes and pretends to be her. Whilst this was a good way to show how devoted Alfred was to his sister, it never really made sense how he was able to copy her voice so well. I know they are twins and all, but still that's pretty impressive. I would love to see a remake dive deeper into their background and show us both of them interacting with each other in the present. Maybe killing Alfred off a little later on could potentially fix this issue. Also, having Alfred not dress up as Alexia also means Capcom can sweep Claire's infamous remark to Alfred under the rug. If you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. If the recent remakes are anything to go by, a change in gameplay style is expected. With a change of perspective, gameplay also has to adapt to fit with this, so if Code Veronica gets a remake, it's very unlikely the gameplay will remain pure. However, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Whilst the RE2 and 3 remakes have their issues, the gameplay for the most part was fantastic. This third-person style gave Capcom a chance to experiment with some cool mechanics, putting the player in front of the horrors they were fighting. Code Veronica in particular had a lot of versatile enemies that attacked the player in different ways. Zombies, dogs, hunters, giant worms, bogeymen, spiders, and killer moths, all of which attacked the player in different ways. Although this variety was great, the restrictions on fixed camera angles placed on combat often made these encounters frustrating. Although this was a problem faced by all the classic games, with Code Veronica it felt a little more potent, as it was difficult for the player to adapt to each enemy's attacks. A lot of areas in the game are often full of multiple enemies, which makes this issue even more noticeable, so a third-person perspective would definitely unlock so much potential for the combat. It seemed like such a waste to have all these enemies, when all you could do was attack them the same way, so having the diverse combat mechanics of 2 and 3 would definitely spruce up the often repetitive combat. Whilst yes, the main focus of the originals was never combat, this view definitely shifted with the remakes, and so it would have to be a necessary inclusion to a potential Code Veronica remake. One thing I really liked from the RE3 remake was the dash feature, which allowed the player to quickly move out of the way of an enemy if they timed it right. This would be a great addition to Code Veronica, as there are a lot of enemies that can either hit you from range or move at you quickly, so having something that can help defend yourself better would help balance the combat a lot more. Recent RE games have also taught us that being chased by an invincible killing machine is a great way to make the player piss their pants. Many can argue that this has become somewhat of a cliche in recent Resident Evil games, as although Mr. X was elevated by his presence in the remake, the idea became less effective each time Capcom used it. I do agree that it would be stupid to add this feature for the sake of it, but luckily Code Veronica already has the pieces necessary to make this feel like a valid addition. A tyrant is present during the first act of the game, coming into contact with Claire a few times before finally meeting its demise by a very large box, and as a result this poor tyrant is quickly forgotten about. He doesn't even have a name. Most tyrants have a cool name. I think it's time we give him one. So Mr. Arsecheeks gets tossed aside as if his life meant nothing, but that could all change in a remake. Whilst previous games have dabbled with the idea of an enemy stalking the player like prey, it's only ever been for short periods of time. A Code Veronica remake could be the game where this finally changes, giving us an enemy that's completely relentless in its mission. This would definitely help make the game become a lot scarier, which would be great as the game is arguably one of the least scary games in the franchise. I'm not saying have Mr. Arsecheeks chase you throughout the whole game, as that would become more irritating than scary after a while, but a section of the game should be dedicated to having this tyrant constantly chasing you, or have the island section dedicated to the tyrant, and then the Arctic section dedicated to Nosferatu, who gets even less appreciation than the tyrant. It's such a shame too, as he is one of the most interesting bosses in terms of abilities, and has one of the coolest designs. To have him only fight you once was a massive disappointment. The Code Veronica remake needs to make this guy a more prominent figure, considering how important he is to the actual lore of the game. Resident Evil overall in terms of genre can be described as horror. The games are regarded as some of the most, if not the most, prominent survival horrors on the market. That's not to say they are totally horrifying. Whilst the games can primarily be categorized as survival horror games, they are known to have comical undertones, never taking themselves too seriously. This allows the developers to have a sense of humor and push the boundaries with each game. Comedy in Resident Evil tends to come from not so much jokes, but rather actual aspects of the games. Whilst the games are great, they aren't regarded as the best due to the quality of writing and voice acting, that's for sure. The original is regarded as the worst in the voice acting department, but I have to say, I think it's Code Veronica honestly. Now I'm someone who loves this game, and I still think the voice acting is bad. The voice acting obviously isn't the reason I love this game. The puzzles, locations, enemies, and Chris are just some of the reasons I love this game. The story was never really a main pull for me. The tone just felt too weird throughout the game. If a remake does come along, then it needs to give the game just a tiny bit more edge. Not too edgy, but just edgy enough that it gives it that typical dark Resident Evil vibe. The game does have scary moments, but they were too far and few between. This next leap forward should have been setting a new standard for horror, but it just doesn't hit the mark. I think fans would definitely appreciate a version of Code Veronica that took itself a little more seriously, as this could open up tons of possibilities to make these enemies and villains of the game more intimidating.
Welcome, Claire. Consider the area you are in a special playground I have prepared just for you.
I'm not going to be scared of someone who laughs like that. Code Veronica is and always will be one of my favourite Resident Evil games. Yeah, the game isn't perfect, but nothing is, besides of course all of you watching. That's why a remake is so exciting to think about, but I have to think realistically too. How does the saying go? History often repeats itself? I'm worried that might be the case.